want to get started, but we are still one committee member shy of the quorum. Still think that we have the potential for the quorum. But we're going to start with our informational item first. But Lori, since you're new to our group, I'm sure you're going to do it to the full group in a little bit. But would you like to introduce yourself to the group?
Hello, everyone. I'm Rhodes. I'm the Deputy Chief Administrative Officer for Land Use. So I oversee all of the land use departments for County Executive Pittman, and that would be Recreation and Parks, Planning and Zoning, Inspections and Permits, Transportation, and Department of Public Works. So I'm always involved in something, and critical area is something that's near and dear to my heart. I mean, I've been meeting with staff talking about how we're looking at these variances and modifications. Matt J. and I formed a close relationship, and I'm glad he's still an ally and partner. So I look forward to looking at the programs, policies, and assisting you guys in your efforts.
You knew all that and you still agreed to join us.
Like I said, the shoes you're filling, but he's always, hopefully he's helping you, that's for sure.
Yeah, he's a great ally.
Yeah.
Yep. Getting to know all the different river keepers, and so it's great.
You're welcome.
Yeah, welcome. So Lisa, you're up. Okay. So I'll just introduce myself because Steve, I know you're also fairly new, and Lori, we've worked a little bit over the years.
On and off.
So.
Yeah, we've still got work to do,
We
Lisa.
know Lori. So welcome both of you. I'm Lisa Herger. I'm the Mapping and Regulations Coordinator for the Commission. And as Debbie said this morning, I'm just going to present to you some draft regulations that we've been working on. And just to give you two some background, what the Commission staff has been doing for the past several years is going through, in the Code of Maryland regulations, the critical area regulations are Title 27, and then we have 3 subtitles. And we've been methodically going through each subtitle and trying to modernize and update the drafting style, and also, in particular with the Shoreline Control Chapter, which we'll talk about today, we've been working alongside of our colleagues at the Maryland Department of the Environment, because their statute has been updated over recent years, just like ours was in not recent, but in 2008. So what we're trying to do is bring our regulations up to speed with like what's been happening in statute and what's been happening in MDE's regulations with regard to shore erosion control. And so we're hoping that that's what we've done here. The reason we're not voting on it today is because I'm still reaching out to the affected stakeholders, which are generally our local government partners with their critical area programs. I've heard from 2 counties so far. Baltimore County has responded, and I'm blanking on who the
St.
other.
Mary's.
Was it St. Mary's? Was
Yeah.
it Bill? Oh, yes.
Bill, yep.
Bill reached out from St. Mary's County. Nothing to make any real changes. Bill just had a question, and Regina Esslinger from Baltimore County just had some suggestions about definitions, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. So that's kind of what we're doing. So this is continuation of yet another chapter in our regulations that we're updating. These regulations consequently were written in 1986. So we're closing in on 4 years. So they really need to be brought up to par. So not real exciting stuff, but it's what I do.
So Lisa, I guess we'll see these again when you have
Yeah.
more of the counties responding to you.
Yeah, we're hoping we'll give them another month. I don't know if the commission's going to have a meeting in August yet, but if we do, it's possible that we'll ask the full commission in the afternoon to vote to give me permission to publish it in the Maryland Register as proposed regulations, and then it'll go through that 90-some day process that it goes through for regulations to be officially promulgated. So yes, you'll hear from me again. The other thing is we're also working on a more comprehensive update of Title 27. So like little piddly things that like we find that aren't in these as we go through it. It's like right now it's a 66-page document. It will get smaller, but you're going to see that in the next couple months too. And some of those are more substantive changes to the regulations, which are going to take me longer to get through stakeholder process. We've reached out to MACO and MML as well. Chesapeake Bay Foundation, who I haven't heard back from yet, but I usually do hear from them one way or the other. So I want to make sure like all those T's are crossed and I's are dotted before we ask you all to vote on regulations to be, published in the register. So as I said, these are the shore erosion control regulations in Chapter 4 of the criteria. And again, we're just modernizing the drafting style because over the years, the Division of State Documents has revised some of the ways that they like us to write regulations, updating them, like I said, trying to bring them up to speed with when statutes and other regulations for other departments have changed. In this case, the Department of Environment's regulations, and then outdated provisions. The one cool thing I found out about Chapter 4, because I'm kind of a nerd about these things, is when you read the regulations as they appear now, they were kind of a little bit ahead of their time. Because remember I said these were 1986, and they talk about using natural non-structural measures. When did the state pass a statute talking about that? Just a few years ago. I don't know, I'm just like, but it does need to be updated, so there we are. So in Title 27, Subtitle 01, and then Chapter 1 are general provisions, and then Regulation 01 are the definitions. And this is the section that has like 70 definitions. We're ridiculous when it comes to definitions. Lori probably knows when you've worked on comprehensive reviews. But we're updating the definition of agricultural best management practice, and it's because if you're following along in your the draft that I've actually sent you, there's a lot of places where we use old language, which refers to shore erosion control, which is what I still call it. But what Maryland Department of Environment regulations call it is shoreline stabilization measures. So we're changing every place in here that talks about shore erosion control to shoreline stabilization measures. That's how exciting that gets. And then we're inserting the new terminology, shoreline stabilization measure, in the regulation, which is a non-structural shoreline stabilization measure as defined in COMAR 26, which are MDE's regulations, and a structural shoreline stabilization measure, again, as defined in MDE's regulations. So we're not going to trump their regulations, we're going to follow what they say. So that is the definition section. Oops, wrong in here. And then as we move into Subtitle 01, Chapter 4, this is the shoreline stabilization measures. And you'll see here, even up on the slide, I put in brackets what we're repealing, which is shore erosion protection works, and we're proposing in the italics shoreline stabilization measures as the new title of this chapter to make it consistent with MDE once again. If you're following along your draft, I'm skipping over a chapter, and I'm going to come back to that in a minute because it has nothing to do with shore erosion. But we'll talk about that in just a second. So with regard to Chapter 4, we're going into Regulation 1 of Chapter 4. We're repealing that old definition, shore erosion protection works, because remember I just said we're inserting the new definition in the general criteria section. And then we're inserting a new regulation, 01-1, applicability, to be clear about certain things that developers or applicants do with regard to water-dependent facilities like marinas or aquaculture facilities, that those types of development activities are independently regulated under that chapter, Chapter 3, and that this chapter, Chapter 4, is just for shore erosion protection work, so things like riprap and living shorelines and such. And then in policies, we're simply doing the redrafting thing, which is what we've been doing with our other chapters, so we're making it, nice and snazzy. Same thing with criteria 03. So we're not proposing any new regulations on the regulated community with regard to shore erosion control. We're just updating these sections. So now we're going into our Chapter 9, which is one of the most important chapters in the criteria, the habitat protection area regulations, and the buffer is in there. That's our numero uno habitat protection area, but it also includes rare, threatened, endangered species, plant and wildlife habitat, indigenous fish, forest tier library, blah, blah, blah. So we're going into the buffer regulation, and we're repealing, again, that old terminology, shore erosion control, and we're inserting the shoreline stabilization measure terminology where it pops up. So if you're looking at your draft, you're going to see the shore erosion control bracketed, and then you're going to see in italics shoreline stabilization measures in the draft. If you go down to the next regulation in chapter 9, 01-2, the mitigation and planting standards, the same business is going on in that section, so nothing substantive, we're just updating. And finally, in regulation 01-3 about the management plans, we're repealing terminology a phrase that says shore erosion control permit as required under NDE's regs, and instead we're inserting in that place local approval of a shoreline stabilization measure as authorized by the Board of Public Works or the Department of the Environment. Because sometimes different types of stabilization measures require board approval and NDE approval, not just MDE approval. So another update with regard to how things have changed over 4 years. So now we're going into a totally different chapter, and this is a fairly new chapter that came online within the last year. And it's chapter 14, and it's the Renewable Energy Generating Systems chapter. So you all might remember this because it should be a little bit fresh in your minds from the past year. And we're going into the Regulation 6, planting plan requirements, and we're doing that thing again where we're repealing erosion control, any type of terminology with regard to erosion control, and changing it to stabilization measure, because that just makes so much more sense after all these years. Because I'm still going to call it true erosion control. But just ignore the woman behind the computer. Okay. So in COMAR Title 27, now we're in Subtitle 02. And Subtitle 02 in COMAR has to do with regulating activities that local governments perform on private lands or lands owned by local governments, or development activities that the state government proposes either on state-owned lands, or sometimes they're on local lands or private lands. It's rare, but it happens. So that's why we have a whole separate subtitle. Generally, the criteria are the same, or in some instances, the criteria in Subtitle 02 are stricter on our state and local partners than it is for private developers in Subtitle 01, because we'd like to torture ourselves. So we're going into the definition section, and we're inserting again, just like we're doing in Subtitle 01, the private developers and private citizens, whoever's doing development activities. Same thing, shoreline stabilization measure is going in for the first time. And then we're digging into Chapter 5, which is state agency actions resulting in development of state-owned lands. We're going in and we're changing the terminology again, so no big deal. And we're also doing that, we're inserting a specific applicability section. So we're mirroring what we've done in Subtitle 02 with regard to shore erosion control. And again, we're repealing and reenacting certain policies and criteria sections. But just like in Subtitle 1, we're not imposing any new regulatory controls on state government projects. We're just doing the same type of updates in their section. And in their planting plan requirements section, again, it's just the whole shuffling of terminology that we talked about before. So now I'm going to talk about the part that I skipped over in your draft earlier. We're going back into Subtitle 01, Chapter 2, which is our development regulation. And this talks about the intensely developed areas, limits of development areas, and resource conservation areas, but it also talks about growth allocation and the standards and the submittal requirements that local governments must provide when they're sending in a growth allocation to the commission. But what it also does is it mimics the statute in that there's very specific instructions that have always been in the statute. And it talks about when a county or a town has their pot of growth allocation. Let's say that when they started, they have 1,000 acres of growth allocation. Certain counties are excluded from the list that's in the statute from being able to use that entire 1,000 acres in changing resource conservation areas to either a limited development area or an intensely developed areas. The counties that are listed in the statute, which are generally the counties on the eastern shore or the rural counties on the western shore, they have a split where they can use, I'm sorry, did I say that right? I think I did. So half of their allocation they can use from a resource conservation area change up to one of the other categories. And the other half, they have to use it from LDA to IDA, if the originating parcel. So there's a limitation on those counties, but what the statute didn't really detail out, which we discovered, a couple of years ago, with Queenstown especially, and maybe another. We had, Queenstown had a growth allocation, and we're looking at the statute, and we're like, wait, this can't apply to towns, especially with Maryland's, growth policies, with Maryland Department of Planning. So we wanted to specify in the language that, and if you look down at 06-3, requirements for new intensely developed growth areas, we're clarifying that the growth allocation allotment, the towns can utilize more than half. So essentially, if a town had 1,000 acres, they can utilize their whole pot in changing a resource conservation area to a limited development area or intensely developed area. They are not restricted because it's the state's goal to grow in places that already have all the infrastructure where our towns are. So we don't want to restrict them in what they can use their growth allocation pots for. So that's what we're doing. It was the intention of the statute, and we've got, review by our Assistant Attorney General on that, and it makes sense and it's consistent with the Maryland Department of Planning's, policies as far as, where we're growing in the state. So we wanted to just clarify that in our regulations. We can't do that in statute because we're not legislators, but we can do that in our regulations. And then finally, skipping back up to 06-1, the submittal requirements for growth allocation, we're making a clarification with regard to the buffer because it's listed, here's all the things you have to show us. And one of the things is the buffer, but what the regulations say right now is 100-foot buffer. And we realize that we want to see any buffer on a growth allocation site plan. So it could be an expanded buffer for hydric soils, highly erodible soils, steep slopes. It could be a buffer to an untitled wetland. So we're taking out 100 foot and we're just saying buffer. So any buffer you have on your site, we want to see it on your growth allocation site plan. And again, we're repealing shore erosion control measure and we're inserting the shoreline stabilization measure. So that, I believe, is it. So a lot of me talking, and a lot of it was all non-substantive changes, but we are inserting that growth allocation blurb that I just went over. And I hope that was clear. And as Jeff said, we're not taking any action today, but in the future we'll ask for a vote.
Is shore erosion protection works and shoreline stabilization measure, do they have the same written definition?
We're repealing the old definition and we're inserting shoreline stabilization measure because we're trying to be consistent with MDE's regulations. So we don't want to confuse the regulated public.
But is there any functional change in the definition?
I think it was updated, when MDE updated their regulations maybe 5 or more years ago now, might be more than 5 years now, we worked alongside of them, and the reason we did that is because we got in their regulations, in their list for an applicant when they're applying for a shoreline stabilization measure authorization, we got in their regs, in their list, that they have to submit a buffer management plan for any impacts to the buffer. So we were like, remember that? Okay. So some of you might remember that. I don't know if you all do. And so we were kind of happy with that. And so they updated that definition. I don't think it's in the statute. I think that the MDE staff updated it to make it, for the regulated public, again, to understand that when we're talking about these types of measures, if it's non-structural, it's this way. If it's structural, this is what it is. So.
Lisa, do you anticipate any of the counties listed here on page 2 of the draft would be applying for exceptions to what you're proposing?
I don't. Most of the counties that are limited to the half allotment, so they can only use half for, properties going to RCA, there mostly are, so the way that the law was written back in 1980s was all of our, and even now they're still basically the same, all of the counties that were already fairly developed, like Baltimore County, Baltimore City, Prince George's, Hartford to a certain extent, the ones that you don't see on that list,
Yeah.
they don't have to really worry about the allotment. It was the rural counties that the legislature purposely wrote in there to give them that exclusion so they could have more flexibility. So we're also making it clear that the towns have that flexibility. So all the counties listed have flexibility.
Yeah. Okay.
And it's because, there could be situations in some of those more rural counties. Some of them aren't as rural than they used to be in the 80s, but it might be that they want to put growth allocation in an RCA that might not be directly adjacent to a town, but for that county, it makes sense. And then there's other provisions in our growth allocation regulations that they have to meet, which are kind of, I would say, ways to ensure that even if they're putting a new LDA or IDA out in the middle of the RCA somewhere, that there's provisions that make that growth acceptable. So counties have to look at a whole other list of requirements to meet if they're going to do that type of development, and the commission looks at it as well. Some of them are policies and some of them are standards, and it has to do with like water and sewer requirements and economic growth, and there's a whole list of things. So I don't think we're going to have any issues. And so far, like I said, I'm still waiting for stakeholder feedback. That's why we're only doing information today, but I don't anticipate anybody's going to.
Yeah.
It's really about just making sure the towns it's clear that the towns can do it anywhere they want.
And to add to Lisa, a lot of the jurisdictions for the towns, some of them have a small pot, but a lot of the jurisdictions, the way it's set up is the towns actually have to go to the counties to request growth allocation for their towns. So the counties still have some control over the process as well in many of the jurisdictions. Like Queen Anne's, I know that's how it works. I think Talbot gave some to towns, but like certain towns like Easton, see a growth allocation in Easton, probably at the end of this year, they have to go back to the county and request acreage. So there is still some county control over the growth as well.
Yeah, okay.
Well, in St. Mary's County, we've given Leonardtown 200 acres of our growth allocation. And what Leonardtown wants to do is they have a master plan that talks about going from the RCA to the IDA. So what you're talking about here is they can use 100 acres of that if they wanted to.
They could use 200 acres.
So they could use it all. I don't think they have that much need, but
Yeah, they may not.
I did see something that was a little over 100 acres in the most,
Okay,
what's the term, generous
okay.
use of the plan.
Yeah, well, with Queenstown, the way that this parcel, I guess, was it in the municipal boundaries, I guess, at that point, Nick? And it had been annexed, but, it was adjacent to the town, it was a farm, and it was RCA. And they wanted to develop on it, but their pot, it was small enough, they had enough for it, but they would have had to use more than half, according to the statute. But the statute implies, we believe, that towns can use their whole pot. They are not restricted by the half allocation. And I don't think they're gonna protest, and I don't think the counties will either. So, any other questions? Sorry if it was, I only had 2 picture slides. All right. Okay, thank you all for your attention. And like I said, it'll be coming back for the real deal. Thanks, Lisa. Sure, thank you.
So Kay is up next for rock call.
I guess it will be in the afternoon.
Hi, everyone. I'm Tay Harris. I'm with the Critical Area Commission, obviously. I'm a natural resources planner. And I'm going to be going through the Rock Hall mapping update. Let me go ahead and pull it up on the screen. Okay, now I was going to keep it super brief. But for those of you that are new here today, I'm just going to make it a tad bit longer, my presentation. So back in 2012, COMAR was updated, and the COMAR was revamped so that we would update our 1,000-foot boundary, critical area boundary, based on the most recent technologies through GIS. And so that's what this mapping update is. And Lisa works with all the jurisdictions, and Bob does, and there's a group that works with, it's the Eastern Shore Regional GIS Cooperative. So they all work together, do ground truthing and using GIS to redraw the boundary. So that's what this is. And we come to Critical Area Commission meetings, and there's usually a few of them, because it's a continual process. So this is Rock Hall's mapping update, and Rock Hall is a small town in Kent County. And as I just discussed, it's per COMAR 270111 that this mapping update is required. And here you can see the gain of 42 acres, and it's shown in green. And then there's a loss of 6 acres, it's shown in red. And there is 460 acres that are remaining the same. So on May 12th, the town council adopted the ordinance to update the map. So based on that, we are recommending that you concur with the chairman's determination to process this mapping update as a refinement and to approve the refinement. And then, go ahead, questions?
You had a map up there, I just want to make reference.
Here we go.
The north side or the above side of that road that becomes green on the right, do those people lose whatever development rights they had prior to this expansion of the map? See on the other side of the road?
Are you talking about, I think he's talking about.
On the right side,
Yep.
Yeah, it's called the right side.
Over here.
over there, see the, yeah.
Yeah, they don't lose their development rights.
No, nobody loses development
Okay,
rights.
so they don't come under a new set of severe, I mean, it happened in St. Mary's where people had development rights, and when the new map was done per GIS, which I agree with, they ended up having to have critical area boundary, the 1,000-foot and 100-foot, of course,
Right,
where they hadn't previously been there.
right.
So they don't lose any of that. They grandfather in whatever they had prior to this.
I think what you might be talking about, Mike, is if it's a resource conservation area, because in the resource conservation area, so 1 dwelling unit per 20 acres. I don't know what our Rock Hall's zoning is for rural, but outside of their boundaries in Kent County, they have Kent County was the only county in the critical area portion of the state that had more stringent agricultural density requirements than the 1 per 20. I think it's 1 per 50 is Kent, and I think like Montgomery County might be, and Baltimore. But all the other counties, like St. Mary's, you guys might have 1 per 10 zoning or something like that. So when one of your constituents or someone in
They would not necessarily be impacted the way these people.
yeah, the people in St. Mary's County, they may have had a 100-acre farm, and they had 1 per 10, so they could get 10, and then they went 1 per 20, so they got 5.
Anyway,
Yeah,
okay,
so
thank you.
you're welcome.
What's that little red loss in the middle of the existing over there? Well, how'd that be cut out there?
Where do you mean?
The little strip of red right there.
Right in the
No, over the other side. No, up here, right in there. How'd that get cut out?
That's
You know what that is, Bob? You remember that? It's bizarre.
I'm looking at it, and it looks like it looks like a stream.
Yeah, he's just starting in car back to the way Ryan.
Yeah.
This all speed.
Yeah.
Because I think that's fucking order.
Yeah, this is just.
I can't hear what they're
it shouldn't be
saying.
shaded red.
This area right here.
Good eyes, all the way back there, too.
What's the answer? I don't know.
That's just change.
Yeah, we'll just.
Okay.
that shouldn't be shaded red.
Seems like it's clerical.
Okay. It's just weird how it got taken out of in the middle. Like, I understand the edges because of the line,
Gail,
but
what
when
are we gonna do with you, what it does without you when you retire? No one's gonna see that kind of stuff.
I just tell them to keep me on and then I'll drive for the cookie, I swear.
Okay, are we done with the map?
Okay.
Do we have any other questions? If not, is there a motion that the commission concur with the chairman's determination that the critical area boundary mapping update for the town of Rock Hall can be processed as a refinement to the town of Rock Hall's critical area program, and further that the chairman approve the town of Rock Hall's map amendment as proposed?
So moved.
Got a first and a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. Thanks, Tay. And Annie's up with our next item.
All right. Good morning, everybody. I'm Annie Sakarik, also a natural resources planner with the Commission. And I'm now going to be presenting the proposed critical area designation changes on the critical area map for the town of Rock Hall. So, as Kate just described, the town of Rock Hall is located in Kent County, and they have requested to update their 1,000-foot critical area boundary map. During this boundary map update process, town and commission staff identified several parcels that need a critical area designation change through either the mapping mistake process or through growth allocation. So first off, a single mapping mistake was identified for the parcel outlined in bright blue on this map, which is also on attachment 1 to your staff report. It's a little bit hard to see, it's just a small little parcel. This parcel was mistakenly mapped as limited development area, or LDA, at the time of original program and map adoption in 1988, even though it met all of the characteristics of an intensely developed area, or IDA. So here's kind of a zoomed in aerial of the parcel, still with the critical area layer over top of it. It meets the standards for a mapping mistake because at the time of original mapping, this parcel was served by public water and sewer. It was and is remaining residential in nature with a relatively small amount of natural habitat. It's adjacent to other small grandfathered lots that are mapped as IDA, and it meets all the state critical area IDA mapping standards. And as you can probably see, it's a little difficult, the existing lot coverage on site does exceed the 15% lot coverage limit for a property in the limited development area. Therefore, the town is requesting to correct this mistake and reclassify the parcel to IDA. So in addition, 5 distinct areas were identified for growth allocation in order to reclassify additional parcels from LDA to IDA. This map highlights those growth allocation areas in bright blue, but they can also be found on attachment 2 to your staff report. During the map review process, County Commission staff determined that these LDA parcels have been developed in a manner that exceeds the critical area LDA development standards. Research uncovered that the town actually received 66.73 acres of growth allocation from Kent County back in 1987. However, the town did not finalize the use of growth allocation for these parcels at that time, as they did not obtain the required approvals from the town council or the critical area commission. Nevertheless, development on these parcels was approved by the town based on the standards for IDA development. This growth allocation request corrects this discrepancy by reclassifying a total of 44.60 acres from LDA to IDA in order to bring them into conformance with the state regulations and the town's critical area program. So here again are some zoomed in aerials. This first one on the left is area number 1 on the attachment number 2. There's a lot of numbers, sorry. This first area here is a marina that's been developed over the 15% lot coverage limit. And area 2 on the right is a subdivision that has also been developed in a manner that exceeds the LDA requirements. The other areas shown on attachment 2 have all been developed in similar manners. All of these parcels meet the critical area growth allocation adjacency standards, as they are either adjacent to existing IDA or proposed within an existing LDA, or both. If this growth allocation request is approved, the growth allocation records for the town and Kent County will be updated to reflect the total deduction of 44.60 acres from the town's existing growth allocation allotment. And so, because the proposed designation change through a mapping mistake is consistent with the critical area law and criteria, and because the growth allocation meets the adjacency standards and corrects an error, staff recommends this request be reviewed as a refinement to the Town of Rock Hall's critical area program. Further, staff recommends that the chairman approve the designation changes as proposed. So I will now turn it over to you, Debbie, for questions.
Do we have any questions for Annie? If there are no questions, do we have a motion that Given that the mapping mistake is consistent with the critical area law and criteria, and given that the growth allocation meets adjacency standards and corrects an error, is there a motion that the commission concur with the chairman's determination that the critical area boundary designation changes for the town of Rock Hall can be processed as a refinement to the town of Rock Hall's critical area program? And further, that the chairman approve the designation changes as proposed, and that the designation shall be incorporated into the town's critical area maps within 100 days of the chairman's approval.
So moved.
Thank you, Commissioner Ferguson. Do we have a second?
Commissioner Vargas, I'll second.
Thank you. All those in favor?
Aye.
Are there any opposed? The motion carries. Thank you, Annie.
Thank you.
And our last item on the agenda is Alex with the Town of Northeast map update extension request.
Okay, thanks, Debbie. Again, my name is Alex Deweese. I'm also a natural resources planner with the Critical Area Commission. This morning, This morning I'll be reviewing the Town of Northeast Critical Area Mapping Update, which is just a request for extension of the deadline. Okay, so just to orient you a little bit, the Town of Northeast is located in Cecil County, which is highlighted on the map of Maryland in red. And then the zoomed in map of Cecil County, you can see that Northeast is also highlighted in red, and it's kind of centrally located off of the Northeast River. So as most of you know, local jurisdictions are required to approve their updated critical area maps within 24 months from the date the Commission transfers the summary draft maps to them. The 24-month deadline for Northeast to approve their draft maps is July 6th, 2022, which is today. The town is unable to meet this deadline due to a few anticipated public hearings that they expect to be in mid-July. But they do expect to adopt the maps completely by the end of this month. So in order to accommodate those meetings, they've proposed a 90-day extension, giving them until October 4th, 2022. Our recommendation is your approval of their request. And any questions?
If there are no questions, is there a motion that the Commission approve the Town of Northeast requested time extension to accomplish local approval of their draft critical area maps by October 4th, 2022?
So moved.
Thank you, Commissioner Hewitt.
I'll second.
Thank you, Commissioner Taylor. Do we have, okay, sorry. All those in favor?
Aye.
Are there any questions or any opposition? Motion carried. Thank you, Alex. And we made it before 12 o'clock.
3 minutes to go, perfect timing.